all know gardening, right? It's relaxing. It's a nice hobby. Get your hands a little dirty. Maybe grow some tomatoes.
Right.
But have you ever thought about it as like, well, scientists are starting to call it a multi-component intervention.
A multi-component
Yeah.
intervention.
It's kind of a mouthful, but what it really means is that there's a lot more going on beneath the surface when we're out there digging in the dirt.
Yeah.
So today, we're going to do a deep dive into the science behind gardening and all of its health benefits.
Ooh, I like that. Digging in the dirt to uncover the science. I'm in.
Yeah. We always go beyond just oh, yeah, gardening's nice.
You're right.
Maybe.
On anecdotal, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
We're going straight to the research, and there's been a ton of it lately, actually.
It has, yeah. There's a lot of interest in this area. And one of the things that's really helpful, at least for us, as we're trying to pull all of this together, is that there was a recent umbrella review.
Yes.
Have you heard of these? They're really cool.
Yeah. Explain it.
Okay, so basically, instead of looking at, hundreds of individual studies, an umbrella review looks at other reviews. So it's like a review of reviews.
Oh, okay.
Gives you like this big picture, a really great overview of a whole field of research.
I love that.
Yeah.
Efficient, thorough, and I think for our listeners, people who are really interested in getting like a deep but fast understanding,
Yes.
this is perfect for them.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's exactly what we're going to do today. We've, gone through all of this, pulled out some of the, I think, most exciting and surprising findings about what science is now saying about gardening. And yeah, hopefully we'll have some aha moments along the way.
Yeah. So no more just anecdotal evidence. We're going to go to the hard science.
The hard science.
All right. So jumping right in, one of the most interesting things that came out of this umbrella review was just how consistently gardening was linked to a whole bunch of mental well-being benefits.
Yeah, it's not just one or two things.
Yeah.
It's like across the board.
It's pretty remarkable. What are some of the things that they found?
So we're talking about things like lower rates of depression and anxiety, better mood, obviously, increased self-esteem, better cognitive function, so thinking more clearly, and overall, just higher life satisfaction.
It is really remarkable because, who wouldn't want all of those things?
Right, exactly.
And I think, there was I remember one specific finding that just jumped out at me. And they talk about this, like a 55% increase in general well-being measures.
I know, 55%. Like, how do you even quantify that, right?
I know, but it just shows you the impact. Like, that is a huge, potential for people to just feel better in their daily lives.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that's pretty cool. All right, so we see these benefits, but the question is, why?
Right. Why is this happening?
What is it about getting your hands in the dirt that is doing all of these amazing things?
Well, it turns out it's not just one thing. It's a bunch of factors working together. So the first one, and this one might seem obvious, but it's important to mention, is physical activity.
Yeah, right. You're out there moving around.
Right. So even if it's not like intense exercise, things like digging and planting and weeding and watering, all those things get your body moving. And we know that any kind of movement helps to release endorphins, those feel-good chemicals in the brain.
Right, yeah.
And it also can reduce inflammation in the body. And all of this comes with a pretty low risk of injury.
Yeah.
Right, compared to some more strenuous activity.
You're not going to pull a hamstring.
Right, exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
So there's the movement aspect. Then there's this whole thing about being in nature in green spaces.
Yes.
And this umbrella review talks about something called the attention restoration theory.
Oh, that's one of my favorites.
Okay, can you break that down? Make it easy for us to understand?
I can try. Yeah. So basically, the idea is that our brains, they have limited processing power.
Right, like a computer.
Yeah, like a computer. We only have so much attention to give.
Right.
And in our modern world, we're constantly bombarding our brains with stimulation and information.
Right.
And we have to direct our attention, all the time to all these different things. And that can lead to mental fatigue.
Yeah.
So the attention restoration theory suggests that natural environments, like gardens, allow our brains to rest, to recover from that directed attention.
Okay.
So it's like giving your brain a break.
Okay.
And it seems like being in nature reduces cortisol, which is that stress hormone. We hear about it all the time.
Right.
And it also seems to improve attention and focus. It can boost creativity.
Wow.
And it helps us to regulate our emotions better.
It's like hitting the reset button.
It really is.
Yeah. Okay. So we've got the movement. we've got the green space, and then they also talk about this mindfulness aspect of gardening.
Right. And mindfulness is such a buzzword these days, but
Yeah.
it really applies here. Because when you're gardening, you're really focused on what you're doing.
Yeah.
You're paying attention to the plants, you're feeling the soil, you're noticing the little details.
Right.
And that kind of focused attention helps us to stay in the present moment.
Okay.
And it can help to reduce rumination, which is that, tendency to dwell on negative thoughts about the past
Yeah,
or
yeah.
worry about the future.
Yeah, yeah. Overthinking things.
Exactly, exactly. So it's almost like a form of active meditation.
Okay.
You're not sitting still, but you're still cultivating that present moment awareness.
Okay. I like that.
And that can really strengthen emotional resilience over time.
I like that. And they mention the social aspect of gardening as well, which I think is really cool.
Yeah, because it's not just, a solitary activity.
Right.
A lot of times you're gardening with other people,
Yeah.
whether it's in a community garden or just, sharing your extra produce with your neighbor.
Or even like bragging about your tomatoes.
Or bragging about your tomatoes.
Right.
Exactly. So, and it also helps us to feel connected to nature's rhythms, to the seasons,
Right. Yeah.
which is something that, in our modern world, we often lose touch with.
Yeah. Yeah. We are very much indoors in our climate-controlled environments.
Absolutely.
So I like that they highlight that because I think, having that sense of connection is really important for our well-being too.
Yeah, absolutely. And the great thing is that all of these benefits don't just apply to people who have, big backyards and, acres to garden.
Right.
Even something as simple as having a few potted plants on a windowsill can make a difference.
That's great to hear.
Yeah.
Because not everybody has access to a yard or a garden plot,
Right.
but, pretty much everybody can have a plant or two.
Exactly.
Okay, so this is pretty amazing, right? It seems like gardening is good for pretty much everybody. But did they find that there were certain groups of people who maybe benefited even more than others?
They did, actually.
Yeah.
So one group that really stood out was older adults.
Okay.
The researchers found that gardening seemed to have particularly profound effects for them.
Interesting.
Yeah, so for older adults, gardening can help to maintain physical function,
Right. That makes sense.
which is really important for staying independent as you age. It also showed improvements in memory,
Okay.
and it can be really helpful in combating loneliness, which unfortunately is a big issue for a lot of older adults.
Yeah.
And there's even been some really interesting work being done with horticultural therapy for individuals with dementia.
Wow.
Yeah. And they've seen some positive results in terms of mood and social interaction, which is really, really encouraging.
So even in cases where there's already some cognitive decline, getting involved with gardening can be beneficial.
It seems like it, yeah. It's really quite remarkable.
And what about younger adults, like people who are just dealing with the everyday stresses and anxieties of modern life?
Well, for adults with mental health challenges, like depression and anxiety, the review found that gardening interventions often led to measurable improvements.
Okay.
So while the exact results varied across different studies, the overall trend was towards a reduction in symptoms of depression and anxiety.
Oh, okay.
And a lot of people reported feeling a greater sense of purpose, a greater sense of accomplishment.
I can see how that would be the case.
Yeah. And of course, it's important to emphasize that gardening is not a replacement for professional therapy if someone is really struggling.
Right.
But it can be a really valuable complement to other forms of treatment.
Yeah, like an extra tool.
Exactly, exactly. An extra tool in the toolkit.
Okay. So we're seeing these mental health benefits, but, often mental health and physical health are linked. Did they find any benefits for physical health as well?
They did. So for people with chronic illnesses like heart disease or diabetes, gardening was linked to healthier eating habits.
That makes sense.
Yeah, because they're growing their own food.
Right.
They have access to fresh produce.
Right. And, we've talked before about how gardening can be a good form of exercise,
Absolutely.
which is good for heart health.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And they also found connections to better weight management and even lower blood pressure.
Wow.
So again, it really highlights how connected our minds and bodies are,
Right.
and how something like gardening can have positive effects on both.
Yeah. So that's really encouraging. It's interesting, though, this review didn't specifically focus on children.
It didn't.
But I know we've talked about in past episodes, there is research showing that gardening can be good for kids as well, right?
There is, yeah. Other research has suggested that gardening can have benefits for children's focus, attention, and even academic performance.
Oh, wow.
So,
more.
again, just more evidence for the wide-ranging positive effects of gardening.
It's pretty amazing when you think about it that something so simple and enjoyable can have all of these benefits.
It is.
But the researchers did point out some things to keep in mind. They weren't just like, oh, gardening cures everything.
No, they were very careful to be scientifically rigorous about this.
Right. So what were some of the limitations that they talked about?
Well, one of the things they mentioned was that, a lot of the studies they looked at, a large percentage, about 71% of them,
Wow.
were rated as having critically low quality.
Okay, what does that mean? Critically low quality.
So it means that based on certain standards that scientists use to assess research,
Yeah.
these studies had some weaknesses.
Okay.
They weren't as strong as they could be.
Okay. What were some of the weaknesses?
Well, some common issues were that many of the studies didn't have good control groups.
What's a control group?
So a control group is basically a group of people who aren't gardening, but are otherwise similar to the people who are gardening.
Okay.
And that helps researchers to figure out if it's really the gardening that's causing the benefits,
Okay.
or if it's something else.
Right.
And a lot of the studies also relied on people's self-reported experiences, which,
Right. Not always reliable.
right, because people aren't always the best judges of their own behavior or their own, feelings.
Right.
And sometimes, they might want to please the researchers and
Right.
say, oh, yeah, I'm feeling so much better since I started gardening,
Right.
even if they're not.
Right. Yeah.
So self-reported data can be tricky.
Okay.
And then, this was kind of surprising to me, the definition of gardening itself wasn't always clear or consistent across the studies.
Really?
Yeah.
You think that would be a simple one? Like, this is gardening, this is not gardening.
You would think, right.
Yeah.
But it turns out that gardening can mean a lot of different things to different people.
Right.
So for some people, it might be, tending a few indoor plants. For others, it might be, working on a large vegetable garden for hours every day.
Right. So there's a big difference in the amount of, physical activity involved, the time spent outdoors.
Exactly. So it makes it hard to compare the results of different studies when they're not all using the same definition of gardening.
Right. Yeah. That makes sense. And then, I think this is important to point out, too, because we talk about it a lot on the show. They also mention the difference between correlation and causation.
Right.
Uh-huh.
And this is a really important distinction in any kind of research.
Yeah. So can you explain that in a simple way?
Sure. So correlation just means that two things happen at the same time, or, they tend to occur together.
Okay.
But it doesn't necessarily mean that one causes the other.
Right. Classic example, ice cream and crime.
Oh, yeah, that's a good one.
Right.
So in the summer, both ice cream sales and crime rates tend to go up.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean that eating ice cream causes people to commit crimes.
Right. Right. Or that criminals really love ice cream.
Or that criminals really love ice cream. Exactly.
It's just that they both happen at the same time because of the hot weather.
Exactly.
Right.
So it's the same thing with gardening. While gardening is linked to better well-being, we can't definitively say, at least not yet, that gardening causes all those benefits.
Right.
It's possible that people who garden also tend to engage in other healthy behaviors.
Okay.
Like they might eat a healthier diet overall.
Right.
They might get more exercise in other ways.
Right.
They might spend more time outdoors in general.
Right.
And all those things could also contribute to their well-being.
Okay, so there are other factors that might be at play.
Right.
But even with all these limitations, they weren't totally negative, right?
Not at all.
There were some positive things that came out of this.
Absolutely.
So what were some of the stronger evidence that they found to support the benefits of gardening?
Well, they were really encouraged by the fact that even in the smaller number of studies that used more rigorous research designs, they still saw consistent positive results.
Oh, okay.
So these are often called randomized controlled trials. And that's kind of the gold standard of research.
Okay, so that's really the best kind of research you can do.
Yeah, it's the best way to isolate the effects of a specific intervention.
Okay.
So in these trials, people are randomly assigned to either a gardening group or a control group.
Okay.
And that helps to eliminate a lot of those other factors that we were talking about that could confound the results.
Okay.
So the fact that even in these really well-designed studies, gardening was still associated with positive outcomes,
Okay.
that suggests that there's something real going on here.
Okay, so it's not just a fluke.
No, it's not just a fluke.
It's not just because gardeners are already healthy people.
Exactly.
There's something about the gardening itself
Right, yeah.
that's contributing to these benefits.
Exactly.
Okay. So looking ahead, based on this research and all of the research that's being done, where do you think things are going with this whole idea of gardening and health?
Well, I think it's safe to say that this is an area that's really gaining momentum.
Okay.
I think we're going to see more and more research being done,
Right.
right? And I think, eventually we might even see doctors prescribing gardening as part of a treatment plan.
Wow, that's interesting. Like,
Yeah.
instead of giving you a pill, they're
So
like, go out and plant some flowers.
go plant some
Let's
flowers.
help your anxiety.
Exactly.
That's really interesting.
And there's a growing movement to incorporate gardening into public health initiatives.
Okay.
So recognizing that, access to green spaces and opportunities for gardening can really improve community health.
Right.
And there's also this growing field of horticultural therapy.
Yeah, we mentioned that a little bit.
Yeah, which is basically using gardening as a therapeutic tool for people with a wide range of mental and physical health challenges.
Okay. Okay, so it's like a real thing.
Yeah, it's a real thing.
It's not just, some fringe idea.
No, it's evidence-based,
Okay.
and it's becoming more and more mainstream.
I love that.
Yeah.
And I think, one of the takeaways from all of this is that you don't have to be an expert gardener to reap the benefits.
Absolutely.
You don't need a huge backyard. You can
Right.
start small.
Start small.
You can have a few plants on your windowsill.
Exactly.
And that can still make a difference.
Yeah, and I think that's really empowering.
Yeah.
Because it means that anyone can do this.
Right.
You don't need any special skills or equipment.
It's accessible.
It's accessible, exactly.
Yeah.
And I think, in our increasingly fast-paced and disconnected world,
Yeah.
gardening offers us a way to slow down, to connect with nature, to get grounded,
Right.
to really tap into those natural rhythms that, are so essential for our well-being.
Yeah. I love that. So, just to kind of wrap things up here, I think, the science is becoming pretty clear
Right.
that gardening is linked to some significant improvements in both our mental and physical health.
Absolutely.
And it's something that's beneficial for a wide range of people. Right. From young to old, healthy to those struggling with various conditions.
Exactly.
And even though more research is always needed,
Always.
we can't just say, okay, we're done, we know everything.
Right.
But the evidence we have so far is really compelling.
It is.
So for you, our listener, I think this gives you some really good insights into a very simple but powerful activity that you might consider for your own well-being.
Right. And it raises some interesting questions, too.
Okay, like what?
Well, in a world where we're increasingly surrounded by screens and technology, how might engaging with nature through gardening offer us a different kind of connection,
Okay,
a different kind of experience?
right.
A way to ground ourselves and find a sense of peace and purpose.
I like that. That's a good question.
It's something to ponder
It is.
as you're out there digging in the dirt.
Yeah. And if you like digging in the dirt, and you liked this deep dive into the science of gardening, be sure to like, subscribe, let us know what you think down in the comments.
Yeah, let us know if you have other topics you'd like us to explore.
Yeah, and maybe in a future episode we can do a deep dive into like the best gardening tools.
Oh, that'd be fun.
Right?
Yeah.
Or resources. Or if you're just getting started, where do you even begin?
Right, right.
Maybe we can provide some guidance there.
Absolutely.
Full disclosure, we might have some affiliate links down in the show notes.
Maybe.
So, support the show.
Support the show.
Support your health.
Support your health. All right, so stay tuned because we have more deep dives coming up.
We do.
Lots of fascinating topics to explore.
Always something new to discover.
Always something new to discover. All right, thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.
See you later.